In Matthew chapter 5, we continue the Sermon on the Mount. And last week, as we've studied through this passage, we saw Jesus and his intention with the law. And remember that Jesus said, "I have not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill." And so Jesus has come to bring a fuller, a richer, a deeper meaning to the law of God. And we're going to see that very powerfully today. Jesus told us earlier in chapter 5 that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus is supremely concerned about our hearts. And we're going to see that very clearly this morning. And in what Jesus says in the following verses in chapter 5, we'll see this not only this week, but in the next couple of weeks to come. Jesus says with this formula, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." And with that statement, Jesus is bringing this fuller, richer, deeper meaning to the law of God. And he's showing us that we must move beyond the external righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, and we need to move to a heart righteousness that is deeper, that is acceptable to God. So this morning we're going to talk about dealing with anger. And what we'll see this morning is that anger is a very serious matter to God. And we'll see this morning that it is of utmost importance to God that you and I have right relationships with others. Relationships are incredibly important to God, and anger destroys those relationships, or it very well can. We'll see this morning that we need to deal properly with our anger before those relationships are broken. And we'll see that God, again, he's examining our hearts. And our right standing before God depends on the condition of our heart. So look with me at verse 21 of Matthew 5. Jesus says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder,' and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." This, of course, is one of the 10 Commandments, and Jesus by no means came to change this law. He didn't come to abolish it, obviously. But Jesus takes it to a new level. He takes it beyond just the physical act of murder. And just on the side, it's probably good to point out here, the command is against murder. You may have "thou shalt not kill," but of course, even in the Old Testament times, God told the people, "You shall not murder," but there was capital punishment for certain crimes that God said they should be put to death. So we're talking about murder, not about all sorts of killing. There is this idea of capital punishment that was approved by God in the Old Testament. But notice what Jesus says in verse 21. "Whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." And the people of Moses' day were instructed to set up judges and to have officers in every town to deal with things like murder. And yes, the one who committed murder would be liable to the court, but again, Jesus is going to take it a step further. Look at verse 22. "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. But I say to you," how shocking that must have sounded to those who were listening to Jesus as he taught. Who is this man? I mean, he's quoting the law of God and saying, yes, that's right, but I say to you. And he's going to add to the law of God? What authority does he have? Where does he get the audacity to do this? And of course, you and I know the answer. He is God. He is divine. He is over and above the law which he gave. And so Jesus has every right to extend, to deepen this command of God, to take it further, to reveal the true meaning of it. And what we see here in this verse is that it is a very serious thing to have anger in your heart. And Jesus here is teaching about unrighteous anger. Is it always a sin to be angry? Well, no. It's not always sinful to be angry. There is such a thing as righteous anger. And I would even say that if we don't at times feel that righteous anger, something's not quite right. There are things that make us angry, and anger is this emotion that all of us deal with that sometimes can flare up in our hearts. And it's not the temptation to hold on to anger. It's not the temptation to say something in anger that's the problem. The problem here that Jesus is talking about is when you allow that anger to sit and to fester and to continue in your heart. That is a very serious thing to God. And notice here that we're talking about this ongoing, persistent anger. It's a present participle, meaning it's an ongoing thing. It indicates that you're just simmering about this. You're just not willing to let this go. You're staying angry. You're nursing a grudge. We all have this anger that comes into our hearts. It flares up, and you're seeing red, right? Have you ever had that happen? It's almost literal, isn't it? You actually kind of see red. And it's been described as a sort of temporary insanity. And that kind of anger that flares up, of course, it's very dangerous. But it's how we deal with that anger, because we're gonna have this emotion come into our hearts. There's not much we can do about it. You just get angry. But it's how you deal with it, and whether you let it sit there and fester. That's the issue at hand. This bitter, ongoing resentment is a very serious and very dangerous thing. It will blacken your heart. It will destroy us. It will destroy the people all around us. And most importantly, this kind of anger in the heart makes us guilty before God. Notice here that this is anger in the heart at this point. Jesus is going to deal in a minute with the things that fly out of our mouths when we're angry. But right now, it's just an anger in the heart. It's not been given an outer expression. There's no words, there's no actions. It's just dwelling within. And perhaps no one knows about that anger that you're holding on to, but God knows about that anger. And it's a very serious matter to him. Jesus is telling us here, you are guilty before God, because God is looking at your heart, and to have anger that is just being nurtured in your heart, that is a sin against God. One commentator put it, I really liked this. God is not only concerned with the fruit of a tree, which would be the physical act of murder, but he's concerned with the root, and that is the anger and hatred that lives within the heart of man. Notice that Jesus says in verse 22, "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court." And you notice that Jesus references the court system in these verses. Well, why is Jesus doing that? Something I puzzled over for a long time. Is he calling for court trials for anger? Is Jesus just saying, be careful about your anger because you might get taken to court over that, and nobody wants to go to court? Well, it goes much deeper than that, doesn't it? There's something much more profound going on here. You look at the flow of the argument between verses 21 and 22. The ancients were told, if you commit murder, you're going to be liable before the court. But I say to you, if you're angry with your brother, you're liable, not just to the court, but you're guilty before God. In God's eyes, we deserve the same court trial, and we're just as guilty as if we had committed murder. That's what Jesus is saying. Anger that we refuse to deal with makes us just as guilty before God as murder. That's hard one. That's a hard one to swallow, isn't it? Just let that sink in for a moment. Anger that we refuse to deal with makes us just as guilty before God as one who commits the physical act of murder. Jesus goes on to say, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing. Caden, in his version, it said raka. That's an Aramaic word, raka. It's a little bit hard to exactly define, but it appears it means something like, you are empty-headed. Right? And so out of your anger that you're harboring for someone, you say to them, you are empty-headed. You are stupid. You're an idiot. It's a very serious matter to God. He says, anyone who says to his brother, raka, or good for nothing, or empty-headed, you shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. This is a very serious offense to God. You'll be guilty before the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin tried the most high-level crimes, the most serious crimes in Israel. And so what is Jesus saying here? To be angry with your brother, to harbor that anger in your heart. To harbor that anger and to then verbally abuse your brother or your sister out of that anger, that is a high crime in the eyes of God. Just like the physical act of murder, it's worthy of death in the eyes of God. And whoever says, the end of verse 22, you fool. So here we're continuing to heap abuse on somebody because of that anger that we won't let go. Whoever says to his brother, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. You fool. To me, this takes it farther even than calling somebody a blockhead, basically. You fool. It's not just insulting someone's intelligence, but you're insulting their heart and their character as a human being. And you're saying to them, you are worthless. I'm so angry at you, and you are worthless. You're worthless spiritually, you're worthless morally. There's just not anything good in you. And Jesus says to us, if your anger goes there, it'll cost us our souls. It will send us into the fires of hell. And those are the words of Jesus, not my words. Well, how many of us have harbored anger for someone in our hearts? How many of us have murdered someone with our angry words? How many of us have had this outburst and lashed out at someone because of our anger that's dwelling in the heart? I would say probably all of us. So we have a big problem, don't we? But the good news here is that Jesus knows our fallen state. He knows how much we struggle with anger, how much we struggle with sin. He knows how much help we need with this. And this teaching is hard for us to hear because I think probably we're all guilty. But these words of Jesus should drive us back to Him. They should drive us and drive us to our knees, to go back to God for His help with our hearts. Should drive us back to those Beatitudes that we read about earlier in chapter 5, to be poor in spirit. Jesus pronounces a blessing on the poor in spirit, and that's to realize and to admit our spiritual poverty and the struggles that we have, admit them to God and ask for His help. It should drive us to be hungering and thirsting for righteousness. God, I know what I am. I know what a failure I have been in this area, but I want your righteousness. And we want to lean on and ask God for His righteousness. Should drive us, these words of Jesus, to strive for purity of heart and to be a peacemaker. And Jesus here, He's not just condemning us. Out of love, He's telling us, you need to understand this about your anger. Not only anger in the heart, but the anger that is expressed. And Jesus is going to give us His help. Jesus here is going to tell us how to deal with these problems, this anger that we can sometimes have. So look with me at verse 23. What is the answer that Jesus gives us? Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Here's what we must do. He says, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, Jesus is talking about worship. In Jesus' time, they still had the temple system. They were still under the old covenant. They would take their offering to the priest to be offered to God as worship to God. So worship here is in view. And if we were to put it in our terminology today, it's like, and if you're driving to church and you remember that your brother or your sister has something against you, you need to do something about that right away. It's like he's saying, if you're walking into the church building and Miss Carol is handing you a bulletin, and you remember and you know, my brother has something against me, Jesus is telling us you better do something about that right away. And notice the way that this is phrased. If your brother has something against you, if they have something against you, you know that something isn't right between you. You can feel that tension sometimes, can't you? You know something is not right. You know that they're upset with you. They're angry with you. Something was said or done, and they're upset. They have hard feelings. And it's not even that you're the one that's upset. It's not even that you're the one who is at fault. But you remember that your brother has something against you. You need to leave your offering. Isn't that what he says in verse 24? Leave your offering there before the altar and go. Dealing with your anger, mending personal relationships is of the highest priority to God. He says you leave worship and you go and you make it right. That sounds strange to our ears, doesn't it? I mean, maybe I go ahead and do worship and then I go and sometime later I'll make it right. That's not what Jesus says. Leave your offering at the altar and go. It is of the highest priority that you fix this personal problem between you and a brother or sister. So Jesus' answer is leave it there. There's something even more important that you need to do in this situation, as important as worship is, right? There's something even more important that you need to do. You need to leave it there and you need to go. Fix it now. Don't wait. Well, but it's not my fault. I'm not the one who did anything here. I'm not the one who's upset. It doesn't say anything about that here. Just that you know that your brother has something against you. Jesus said, go. Go quickly. And Jesus said you need to be reconciled to your brother. You need to do everything you can to make peace and to reconcile and to be friends again. Well, this probably causes us to ask some questions in our minds. Why such urgency? Drop everything you're doing and go. Why, Jesus? Because anger is so dangerous. It is so destructive. And it's not only destructive to you, but it's destructive to others. And the longer that you let it go on and that you harbor anger or let someone else harbor anger in their heart, it gets harder and harder and harder to fix it. Go right away. Well, Jesus, why go if I'm not the one who's the problem here? Well, maybe we're a part of the problem and don't realize it. I've had that happen before. And maybe you go even if it really isn't anything that you've done because your brother's soul is in danger. If he or she, if they are harboring anger toward you, they are in grave danger. Do you want them to go into the fiery hell? Then go. Help them. Help the situation. Do everything you can in your power to make peace. As far as it depends on you, make peace with all men. Go. Well, Jesus, why prioritize these right relationships even over worship of God? I think one major reason here is that God does not accept our worship when personal relationships are left purposefully damaged. Our worship doesn't mean anything to God when we're carrying on like this, being angry and being at odds with somebody, and we refuse to fix it. The way you treat others is an essential part of true and pleasing worship to God. And so I ask you this morning, do you have unresolved anger in your heart towards someone? Have you lashed out in anger against someone? You and I, when we do that, we're in grave danger. It's very serious in the eyes of God, as we've seen. And so I ask you, the Lord asks you, don't wait. Take care of it right away. For your sake and for the sake of the other that's involved, because your soul and their soul are in danger. And if you're struggling with anger, and I think it's fair to say that we all do, would you come to Jesus for his cleansing power? Would you repent of your anger and let him cleanse your heart? Would you come to Jesus and let him shape you and shape and mold your heart by his Spirit that he's caused to dwell within us in Christ? And you can walk in a right relationship with God again and with man again. And God stands ready to help you. Jesus stands ready to help you. So if you need to make it right, I pray that you would do that. If you need prayers today, if you need to respond to the invitation that Jesus is always offering to put him on in baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, because you trust him, you believe in him, we would love to help you with that if we can. If you need anything at all, feel free to let it be made known. Let's stand together and sing.